Hi, my name is Jennifer Madrid, and this is my CRJ 306 presentation. And in this presentation, we were supposed to focus on different issues affecting crime in our criminal justice system. So, in my overall presentation, I'll be going over the topic of youth involved in crime. But in my presentation, I'll be focusing on different subcategories such as victims of crime, youth as offenders, and racial youth policed. And then at the end, I'll be explaining a program that is benefiting youth and families today. So, when we first think about our juvenile population, we don't really think of it as a big group of individuals, but in fact, proven wrong. According to the U.S. Census Bureau in 2010, juveniles made up 1/4 of the total United States population, so that's a pretty big number. According to our text, The Color of Justice, Race, Ethnicity, and Crime in America by Samuel Walker, Casillas Bone, and Miriam DeLone, our youth consist of being 56% white, 15% African American, 5% Asian, 1% American Indian, and lastly 23% Hispanic. So, when we think about victims of crime, we assume that a majority of the victims are white, right? Because that's just how society has perceived victims to be. So that's actually the complete opposite. In fact, people of color are more than likely to be victimized by crime. And to give you an even more detailed example, Hispanics run the highest rate of victimization out of all the race and ethnicities. So, research and data statistics are gathered by the National Crime Victimization Survey, so the NCVS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, the NIBRS, and lastly, the Supplemental Homicide Reports that is part of the FBI. So, when we think about different crimes that victimize individuals, there's a whole bunch of crimes that have victims, but I'm going to be going into detail about two. So to give you an example of people of color being victims of crime, we'll be looking at property crimes. So some statistics show that there are higher numbers of African American youth that are victims of this crime, youth that are living in urban areas and that live on the west side. So another type of crime that people of color, especially youth, are victims of are victims of violent crimes. So crimes under this category are rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and just assault. And in fact, ironically, youth are reported to have higher numbers of victimizations than adults. And you may ask, why is this higher in youth than adults? So some factors are because of families, the individuals themselves, the community that they're involved in, and the environment that they surround themselves in vary between the youth. So, as mentioned in our text, Janet L. Lauritsen found that the amount of time the youth spent at home and the length of time the youth had lived in his or her current home had a negative effect on risk of violent victimization, and that youth who lived in single-parent families faced a greater risk than those who lived in two-parent family households. So, next we'll be going into the topic of youth as offenders. So when we think about youth as offenders, we think of them just as those that have been caught and are in the juvenile system or in juvenile detention. But in fact, it's even including those that have been to court. So data collected for youth as offenders relies on arrest statistics and perceptions of crime victims. So we found that African Americans comprised 15% of the juvenile population, and based on all the violent category crimes, which are homicide, rape, and aggravated assault. Um, they found that African American youth fall made up 52.4% of the juvenile arrests in the violent crime categories. So, to look at this more in a different perspective, I looked at two different articles that were provided to us in Module 4. One of the articles was Childhood Adversity Among Court-Involved Youth, Heterogeneous Needs for Prevention and Treatment by Patricia Logan Green, B.K. Elizabeth Kim, and Paula Nurius. And in this article, it showed a study about youth who are falling under different risk class according to ACE, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so I'll be going more into depth of the statistics found in these two different class groups. So in the low risk class group, they found that it had the lowest levels of ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, for each adversity. Only 17.5% had a history of paternal incarceration, so one of their parents were incarcerated, so only 17.5% fell under that category. 49.7% reported that they had elevated family conflicts, and 22% in the low risk class reported that they were living with both parents. So remember earlier in the presentation that it was mentioned that living in a single household family gives you more of a chance of being a victim of a crime, while it also gives you a higher risk of being an offender. So in the high risk class, it had the highest adversity indicators, meaning family incarceration, parental mental health problems, and parental drug use. So in this high risk class, it was more of like middle class to wealthy students that were found to be a part of this category. So in the second article, Juvenile Life Without Parole, an overview by Josh Rovner, it was focusing on the Sentencing Project. And basically what the Sentencing Project was, in 29 states, they got rid of life without parole for juveniles who were convicted in the court system. So in this project, it found that 79% of the juveniles witnessed violence in homes, 32% grew up in public housing, 40% had been enrolled in special education courses, and fewer than half were attending school at the time of their conviction. 47% were physically abused. 80% of the girls who were in the sentencing project experienced some type of physical abuse, and 77% had experienced sexual abuse. So then we go into racial youth policed. So when we look at racial youth policed, we look at youth that have had some type of contact with police officers or some type of law enforcement. And ironically, you would think that adults have more contact with law enforcement, but in fact, it's actually youth. Youth have been reported to have the highest level of contact with police, and that's the reasoning behind that is because they're out on the streets more. Juveniles are always wanting to be active and productive in some way, and if they don't have the means for it, then they'll find their own way and go search for it in the streets. And adults, usually they go to work, go grocery shopping or errands that they have to do, and then go back home. So they're not really out in the streets as much as youth. So it was found that youth in low income, who identified as low income, were out in the streets more often, and that's because they don't have the means to be in different different programs that you have to pay for. So recreational sports, you have to pay to be in it, or different after school programs, you have to pay a fee to get in there, and sometimes these families don't really have the financial stability to be providing those youth the opportunities. So it was seen that medium to high class juveniles had more opportunities, and so they had less contact with police officers. But it was found that the highest levels of contact and the highest levels of attitudes towards the police were with African American youth. And that's just because they've been stopped more than any race or ethnicity. And so the more times that they've been stopped, the more negative perceptions that follow police officers. And lastly, I'll be talking about a program that is benefiting our youth today. So I came upon this program called La Oportunidad that is based in Minneapolis. And what this program is, it's a nonprofit that is helping Latino youth and Latino families in the community and giving them different opportunities and resources to better themselves and give them a better education, better resources that they weren't aware of, and just different opportunities to have a better life. So this nonprofit was providing effective educational and supportive programs that enable Latino individuals and families to achieve positive educational and social outcomes. The mission of the program was to provide bilingual and culturally relevant, research-based and family-centered programs for youth, adults, and families. And basically what it was doing, it was just creating different programs for either the families, so the parents, or just the youth. And they have different conferences for Latin youth, so that way they get more educational experiences or professional experience. And so it's trying to create resilient youth, trying to connect the youth to their culture or their heritage, and trying to give these youth the opportunities for them to grow and succeed in the future. And the families and the parents in this program are just encouraged to have a strong, healthy, and economically stable family. So it's just giving them the resources to help maintain that goal. So I found out that this program is funded by donors. I'm not sure if they're funded by any grants, but I was able to find out that they heavily depend on donors and donations. And I think their biggest donation comes from a council in Minneapolis, and a committee. So that concludes my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. So thank you.